Mid-July 1944, a cramped briefing tent behind the Normandy hedgerows. An exhausted American sergeant with grease-stained hands stands before skeptical officers, describing steel tusks welded to a Sherman tank. The laughter starts before he finishes. One captain mutters about farm equipment. A major returns to maps showing an advance measured in yards purchased with American blood. One soldier eliminated for every 7 feet of French soil. What these officers didn't know was that this 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey had just solved the tactical nightmare that paralyzed the Allied advance for 6 brutal weeks. Within days, his crude invention would transform the deadlocked Battle of Normandy into a breakout so devastating that German commanders would lose entire armies before understanding what happened. Curtis Grubb Culin III had invented the weapon that would break Nazi Germany's grip on France, and all it required was scrap metal, a welding torch, and the willingness to see potential where others saw problems. The Norman bocage in July 1944 was a killing ground of horrifying efficiency. Ancient earthen embankments, topped with tangled masses of trees and bushes, divided the countryside into a checkerboard of natural fortresses. Each field, typically 300 feet on a side, was surrounded by walls averaging 4 feet high but reaching 15 feet in places. Centuries-old roots had woven through the earthen banks into structures solid as concrete, barriers that looked innocuous from the air but became death traps at ground level. The Germans had perfected these defenses, selecting positions for machine guns and anti-tank weapons, pre-sighting artillery coordinates, and practicing movement through the vegetation maze. A machine gun team in a hedgerow commanded overlapping fields of fire. Anti-tank positions could engage American armor at point-blank range with devastating effect. For American tankers, the hedgerows were an impossible equation. When a Sherman attempted to climb over, the hull tilted upward at 45 degrees, exposing the thin belly armor to German weapons, while the tank's own guns pointed uselessly skyward. The crew became blind, vulnerable, and helpless for 3 to 5 seconds. German gunners waited for this moment. A single Panzerfaust round, costing perhaps $20 to manufacture, could penetrate the Sherman's belly and transform 30 tons of steel into a funeral pyre. The statistics told a brutal story. In 6 weeks following D-Day, American forces advanced 20 miles at a cost exceeding 40,000 casualties. The 29th Infantry Division suffered 3,700 casualties fighting for St. Lo. Infantry companies that landed with 180 men were down to 60 effectives after 2 weeks. Tank losses were equally horrifying. Engineers tried explosives, blowing gaps large enough for tanks. This failed strategically. The blasts announced American intentions, allowing German artillery to bracket breaches and anti-tank teams to prepare ambushes. Bulldozers could tear through hedgerows but were conspicuous, slow, and few in number. German gunners targeted them first. By early July, the Allied advance had stalled into brutal attrition that consumed men and materiel at rates that represented strategic failure. Curtis Grubb Culin III wasn't supposed to solve this problem. Born February 10, 1915 in Cranford, New Jersey, Culin was 29 in July 1944, ancient by combat soldier standards. He served with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the New Jersey National Guard, assigned to the 2nd Armored Division. His ancestor, Colonel Curtis Grubb, had fought the British during the Revolution, but Culin himself was a Depression generation product who learned to improvise solutions from whatever materials were available. The breakthrough came during a soldier bull session in mid-July. Tankers, infantrymen, and support personnel discussed the hedgerow problem with dark humor and casual creativity. A soldier Culin described as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts made what seemed absurd. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The others laughed. Curtis Culin didn't. While comrades dismissed it as crackpot thinking, Culin recognized fundamental soundness. If you couldn't go over hedgerows without exposing belly armor, and couldn't go around them because Germans covered every gap, you had to go through them. And to go through, you needed cutting tools strong enough to shear through centuries of root growth. Culin began sketching designs. His concept was simple: steel blades mounted at angles designed to cut into the earthen embankment rather than ride over it. The blades would act like enormous plows, using the tank's weight and power to tear through obstacles. The key insight was keeping the hull level during breach. If blades bit in at ground level, the tank would push through rather than climb over, maintaining weapons pointed forward and belly armor protected. Raw materials were everywhere. Germans had littered invasion beaches with thousands of Czech hedgehogs, massive steel anti-tank obstacles that had failed to stop the Allied landings. Culin requisitioned a cutting torch and went hunting. He cut steel I-beams to appropriate lengths, shaped the ends into points that would penetrate earth and roots, and angled them to create a four-pronged plow distributing cutting forces across multiple points. The tusks, massive steel fangs, were welded to a mounting plate attached to the tank's transmission housing. The entire contraption weighed perhaps 200 pounds and could be fabricated by any competent welder in hours using materials lying around every Normandy beach. It was crude, ugly, and looked like rejected farm equipment. It was also exactly what the Allied armies needed. Cullen's first test used a borrowed tank. The crew backed off several hundred yards from a typical hedgerow and accelerated to 10 miles per hour. What happened next was, in General Omar Bradley's words, both simple and revolutionary. The steel tusks bit into the embankment at ground level, penetrating root mass and earth with the force of 30 tons driven by 500 horsepower. The tank didn't climb, it plowed straight through, nose dipping slightly as tusks shredded centuries of growth. The entire breach took less than 30 seconds. When the Sherman emerged, weapons were still pointed forward, armor configuration unchanged, and it had created a gap wide enough for following vehicles. Word spread rapidly through military channels. The prototype was demonstrated for increasingly senior officers. Bradley arrived at the demonstration site with the skepticism of a commander who'd seen promising innovations fail. What he witnessed transformed his operational concept for the Normandy breakout. Bradley's official account captured the moment. The tank backed off and ran head-on toward a hedgerow at 10 miles an hour. Its tusks bored into the wall, pinned down the belly, and the tank broke through under a canopy of dirt. So absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks, the tusk-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old sergeant. Bradley ordered maximum production before Operation Cobra launched. The fabrication became a priority for every ordnance unit in Normandy. Welders worked around the clock under camouflage netting. Crews scoured beaches for Czech hedgehogs, cutting them into lengths and shaping them into the four-pronged configuration that became known as the rhinoceros device. The name was inevitable. Tanks with tusks looked like mechanized rhinoceroses. Soldiers called modified tanks rhinos, and the nickname spread faster than official nomenclature. Approximately 500 hedgerow cutters were manufactured in 3 weeks, a phenomenal industrial effort under combat conditions with improvised tooling and salvaged materials. Nearly 3/4 of the 2nd Armored Division's tanks were equipped before Operation Cobra commenced. British forces immediately began producing their own version called prongs, manufacturing over 2,000 units. The psychological impact on American forces was profound. President Eisenhower later described it. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. Tankers who approached hedgerows with dread now viewed them as obstacles to demolish. The tactical capabilities increased exponentially. A Rhino-equipped Sherman could breach a hedgerow in 30 seconds without exposing vulnerable armor. American tanks could now advance through bocage at rates measured in fields per hour rather than yards per day. Operation Cobra launched July 25th with massive aerial bombardment. 1,500 heavy bombers dropped over 3,000 tons of explosives on German positions. 1,000 medium bombers followed with 60,000 incendiary bombs. 1,100 artillery pieces delivered sustained bombardment. The bombardment inflicted horrific losses on defenders, particularly the elite Panzer Lehr division, which lost nearly half its strength. But the difference was what happened when American armor advanced. Rhino tanks didn't follow roads or seek gaps. They created gaps wherever commanders needed them. Entire formations plowed through hedgerows in battalion strength, bursting into German positions from unexpected directions. The psychological shock was profound. Hedgerows that had been impregnable barriers became meaningless obstacles demolished without slowing down. The German defensive system, predicated on channeling advances into killing zones, collapsed when American armor stopped being channeled. The breakthrough occurred July 27th. The 30th Infantry Division reported organized resistance had crumbled. By July 31st, the First Army emerged from the bocage into open country. American forces had spent 6 weeks advancing 20 miles at 40,000 casualties. Operation Cobra, enabled by the rhinoceros, allowed 50 miles advance in 6 days. The breakout was achieved. Field Marshal Gunther von Klug attempted counterattacks but failed. Forces were depleted, reserves consumed, and German commanders couldn't re-establish lines when American armor simply plowed through hedgerows and bypassed strongpoints. By August 8th, General Patton's Third Army captured Le Mans. The war of mobility Allied planners envisioned had finally been unleashed, and the instrument was welded steel tusks from salvaged German beach obstacles. The Falaise Pocket, where German forces became encircled, resulted directly from mobility enabled by rhinoceros-equipped tanks. Between August 16th and 19th, approximately 60,000 German soldiers were eliminated or captured. Nearly all guns, tanks, and vehicles were abandoned. Wehrmacht formations that contained the beachhead ceased to exist. Paris was liberated August 25th. The Allied advance that stalled in hedgerows became a pursuit across France that didn't stop until logistics forced a pause at the German frontier in September. Curtis Culin's contribution didn't end with invention. He attempted repeatedly to ensure credit went to the soldier he remembered as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts, who first suggested saw teeth on tanks. But publicity overwhelmed Culin's honest attempts at attribution. Roberts disappeared into history as one of those anonymous contributors whose insights change outcomes but whose names are forgotten. Culin became what historian Max Hastings called a very American kind of national hero, celebrated in newspapers and military histories as the sergeant whose crude invention smashed the German line. Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest decorations for non-commissioned personnel. President Eisenhower cited the invention in public addresses years later, but Culin remained uncomfortable with attention, insisting Roberts deserved credit and that the invention emerged from soldier discussions rather than individual brilliance. The war wasn't finished with Curtis Culin. In late 1944, during brutal Hurtgen forest fighting, Culin lost his left foot to a landmine. The sergeant who enabled the Normandy breakout became another casualty statistic. After recovering, Culin returned to the United States and attempted to rebuild civilian life. He married in 1945 in Cranford, New Jersey, and worked as a liquor salesman in New York City. The marriage ended in divorce in the early 50s. Culin passed away November 20th, 1963, at age 48. His hometown erected a memorial commemorating his invention and its contribution to Allied victory. The tactical lessons extended beyond Operation Cobra's immediate impact. Military analysts identified broader principles. First, tactical problems often require practical solutions rather than sophisticated technological approaches. The hedgerow problem baffled senior officers and planners. The solution came from a sergeant who recognized simple mechanical principles could overcome complex tactical obstacles. Second, innovation emerges from junior personnel who work directly with equipment and understand operational constraints in ways senior commanders cannot. Conversations among soldiers produced the breakthrough that formal planning sessions failed to generate. Third, material superiority only matters when forces can bring it effectively to bear. American forces possessed overwhelming advantages, but terrain neutralized them until the rhinoceros modification solved the tactical problem preventing effective employment. Contained the Allied beachhead for 6 weeks, ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces. Paris was liberated August 25th. The Allied advance that had stalled in the hedgerows of Normandy became a pursuit across France that did not stop until logistics, rather than German resistance, forced a pause at the German frontier in early September. The campaign that liberated France and Belgium in the summer of 1944, the campaign that shortened the war by months and saved countless Allied lives, was made possible by many factors. Overwhelming Allied material superiority, air supremacy, tactical skill, and soldier courage. But the tactical innovation that transformed stalemate into breakout came from a 29-year-old sergeant who saw potential in an idea others mocked. Curtis Culin's contribution did not end with the invention. According to military historian accounts, Culin attempted repeatedly to ensure credit was given to the soldier he remembered as a Tennessee hillbilly named Roberts, who had first suggested the concept of saw teeth on tanks. But publicity surrounding the invention overwhelmed Culin's honest attempts at attribution. Roberts, whoever he was, disappeared into history as one of those anonymous contributors whose insights change outcomes, but whose names are forgotten. Culin became a very American kind of national hero, as historian Max Hastings described him, celebrated in newspaper accounts and military histories as the sergeant whose crude invention had smashed the German line. The publicity was not entirely welcome. Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, one of the highest decorations available to non-commissioned personnel, in recognition of his innovation. President Eisenhower cited the invention in public addresses years after the war, but Culin himself remained uncomfortable with the attention, repeatedly insisting that Roberts deserved credit and that the invention was a team effort emerging from soldier discussions rather than individual brilliance. The war was not finished with Curtis Culin. In late 1944, the 2nd Armored Division participated in the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen Forest, where American forces suffered devastating casualties in a prolonged battle that accomplished little strategic gain. Culin lost his left foot to a landmine during this campaign, a wound that ended his combat service and resulted in medical evacuation. The sergeant who had enabled the breakout from Normandy became another casualty statistic in a war that consumed soldiers with mechanical efficiency. After recovering from his wounds, Culin returned to the United States and attempted to rebuild a civilian life. He married Bernice Enright in 1945 in Cranford, New Jersey, and moved to New York City, where he worked as a liquor salesman for Schenley Industries, the same company that employed his father. The marriage ended in divorce in the early 1950s. Culin died November 20th, 1963, at the age of 48. His hometown of Cranford erected a public memorial outside the municipal building commemorating his invention and its contribution to Allied victory. The tactical lessons of the rhinoceros modification extended beyond the immediate impact on Operation Cobra. Military analysts studying the Normandy campaign identified several broader principles. First, that tactical problems often require practical solutions rather than sophisticated technological approaches. The hedgerow problem had baffled senior officers, engineers, and tactical planners. The solution came from a sergeant who recognized that simple mechanical principles could overcome complex tactical obstacles. Second, that innovation often emerges from junior personnel who work directly with equipment and understand operational constraints in ways that senior commanders cannot. The conversations among soldiers discussing the hedgerow problem produced the breakthrough insight that formal planning sessions had failed to generate. This validated the principle that organizations succeed when they listen to personnel at all levels rather than assuming wisdom flows only from top to bottom. Third, that material superiority only matters when forces can bring that superiority to bear effectively. American forces in Normandy possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, firepower, and logistics. But these advantages were neutralized by terrain that prevented their effective employment. The rhinoceros modification transformed material potential into operational capability by solving the tactical problem that had prevented American armor from operating effectively. Fourth, that psychological factors in warfare can be as important as material factors. The morale boost provided by the rhinoceros modification extended beyond the tankers who operated the equipment. Infantry forces fighting alongside Rhino tanks displayed increased confidence and aggressive spirit because they knew armor support could now penetrate hedgerows and provide direct fire support. German defenders experienced corresponding morale degradation when obstacles they had relied upon proved useless against modified American tanks. The story of Curtis Culin and the hedgerow cutter represents a peculiarly American approach to warfare, the belief that practical ingenuity can overcome sophisticated defenses, that problems exist to be solved rather than accepted, and that the best solutions often come from unexpected sources. The Depression generation that produced Culin had learned to improvise solutions from available materials. The National Guard tradition he represented valued practical competence over formal credentials. The result was an innovation that changed the course of the Normandy campaign and demonstrated that wars are won not only through strategic planning and material production, but also through the creativity of individual soldiers willing to see possibilities others miss. In the summer of 1944, when the Allied advance had stalled in the hedgerows of Normandy and officers spoke grimly of casualty rates that resembled World War I attrition, a sergeant from New Jersey looked at German beach obstacles and saw the raw material for a breakthrough weapon. He welded steel tusks to a tank and demonstrated that hedgerows, which had paralyzed armies, could be demolished in seconds. The laughter that greeted his initial presentation turned to awe when the first rhinoceros tank plowed through a hedgerow that conventional wisdom had declared impassable. 3 weeks later, more than 500 Rhino tanks smashed through the German defensive line and unleashed the American army in a pursuit across France that did not stop until German resistance collapsed. The Tusks they had mocked became the tools that broke the Nazi grip on Western Europe. And the sergeant they had dismissed as a farm equipment dreamer became the man whose crude invention helped win the war for France and shortened World War II by months. Simple solutions to complex problems, practical ingenuity overcoming sophisticated defenses, the creativity of common soldiers changing the course of history. These were the lessons of Curtis Culin's hedgerow cutter, lessons that remain relevant wherever forces confront obstacles that conventional approaches cannot overcome. The hedgerows of Normandy still stand, marking the fields where American soldiers fought and eliminated the forces for every yard of French soil in the summer of 1944. Some of those hedgerows still bear the scars of rhinoceros tanks that plowed through them 7 decades ago, testament to the moment when welded steel tusks and American determination combined to break the German line and liberate a continent. Curtis Culin did not live to see the full recognition his invention deserved, but his contribution to Allied victory was profound and permanent. When historians assess the factors that decided the Battle of Normandy, they list air superiority, material advantage, strategic deception, and soldier valor. And increasingly, they note the contribution of a sergeant who refused to accept that hedgerows were impassable obstacles and who demonstrated that sometimes the difference between stalemate and victory comes down to 4 steel tusks welded to the front of a tank by someone willing to try what others dismissed as impossible. That was Curtis Grub Culin's legacy, the demonstration that wars are won not only through grand strategy and overwhelming force, but also through the practical problem-solving of common soldiers who refuse to accept that obstacles are permanent. The hedgerows that paralyzed Allied armies became speed bumps for rhinoceros tanks. The defensive system that the Germans believed would contain American forces indefinitely was demolished in days, and the sergeant they had laughed at became the man whose invention unleashed the mechanized avalanche that swept German forces out of France and brought the Allied armies to the borders of the Third Reich. Simple innovation, profound impact, one sergeant's refusal to accept defeat. That was the story of the hedgerow cutter, the weapon that broke the German line and unleashed the American army to finish the liberation of Europe.